John McDonnell.
This morning, Mr. Speaker, this morning we've heard the verdict from the trial following the tragic murder of Joe Cox. Joe Cox's murder robbed this House of a fierce advocate for social justice and a passionate campaigner. Her killing was an attack on democracy itself. Our thoughts are with her family this morning. Mr. Speaker, today's statement places on record the abject failure of the last 6 wasted years and offers no hope for the future. The figures speak for themselves. Growth down, wage growth down, business investment down, and their own deficit target failed. The debt target failed. The welfare cap failed. We've heard today, Mr. Speaker.
Order. Let me just say now, if members on either side want to shout out, don't bother to stand because you won't be called. I say that to members on both sides. Stop it. It's juvenile, low grade and hugely deprecated by the public, whose support we should be seeking and whom we should try to impress, not to repel. John McDonnell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've heard today there will be more taxes, more debt and more borrowing. The verdict could not be clearer. The so-called long-term economic plan has failed. And as the Treasury's own leaked paper revealed, the government knew it had failed before the referendum result was announced. And we now face Brexit, the greatest economic challenge of a generation, and we face it unprepared and ill-equipped. The new Chancellor acknowledged the failure himself in October of the economic strategy when he promised a reset of economic policy. So today we expected a change of direction after those 6 wasted years. Instead, we've seen further cuts to earnings for those in work through cuts to universal credit and a living wage increase that is lower than expected under the previous Chancellor. This is a new Conservative leadership with no answers to the challenges facing our country following Brexit and no vision to secure our future prosperity. Just turning to Brexit, Labour respects the decision of the British people to leave the European Union, but the chaotic Tory handling of Brexit threatens the future prosperity of this country. The Chancellor must now do the right thing for British workers and businesses. He must insist on full tariff-free access to the single market. He and the Treasury know that's what will give the best deal for jobs and prosperity here. I just say it may not be in the Chancellor's nature, but in the national interest, I urge him to stand up to the Prime Minister and the extreme Brexit fanatics in her cabinet. If he stands up for British businesses and jobs in fighting for single market access, he will have our full support. But after 6 wasted years, wages are still lower than 2008. Self-employed people are on average paid less than a generation ago. 6 million people are earning less than the living wage. Too many people are having to worry about buying school uniforms, affording a family holiday, or even just paying the rent or mortgage. We've had a month of briefing from the party opposite on those people who are called just about managing, the jams. To the party opposite, these people are just an electoral demographic. To us, they're our friends, our neighbours and the people we represent. Let me tell you what they are, why they are just managing. Why are they just managing? It's the results of Tories imposing austerity on an economy that couldn't bear the strain. We've seen productivity stagnate, but there's nothing in this autumn statement on the scale needed to overturn those 6 wasted years. If the Chancellor really wants to make a fair tax system as well, he can start by bringing back the 50p rate for the very richest in our country. And it is familiar, hollow rhetoric from the Tories on tax avoidance when they've cut the resources at HMRC, the very people there staffed to collect the taxes themselves. Resources available to HMRC today are 40% less than they were in 2000. The Chancellor has frozen in-work benefits at a time when food prices are rising and we don't expect wages to keep up. We need an economy that is fundamentally more prosperous and where that prosperity is, yes, shared by all. The increase in the national living wage announced today are actually lower than expected and leave the poorest paid workers still earning less than they need to live on. So I ask the Chancellor to adopt a real living wage level, as Labour has pledged to do, and abandon his predecessor's empty rhetoric. Regrettably, the Chancellor is still going ahead with some of the cuts to universal credit. Thanks to the pressure, and I pay tribute to those MPs on all sides of the House who've campaigned on this issue, thanks to that pressure, he's offering to soften the blow. We do not want the blow softened, we want it lifted altogether. Today's changes will leave a single parent on average at least £2,300 worse off. These are the very people who are working hard to deliver for their families, and the government is betraying them. As for the people with disabilities put through the ordeal of the discredited work capability assessment, who are trying to get themselves ready to return to work just about managing, they still remain in the Chancellor's firing line, cutting £30 a week from the support that these disabled people receive. It is scandalous in our society. Those who are just about managing also rely upon our public services. They send their children to local schools. They depend on their local hospital. They rely on their council services like cleaning the streets, tending to their parks and playgrounds, and opening their libraries. But the reality is, after 6 wasted years, our public services are just not managing. Today, the childcare that parents rely upon remains underfunded, as the Public Accounts Committee has reported, and it will remain underfunded even after the announcements today. I want to pay tribute as well to the honourable members for Swansea East and Erith and Thamesmead for their important work in bringing the issue of child burial fees to the public attention. And I ask the government to do the right thing on child burial fees and reconsider making funding available for families in these desperate circumstances. Councillors from all political parties are reporting that they are at a tipping point in the provision of social care. The previous Chancellor cut nearly £5 billion from social care, meaning now that over 1 million people who need care aren't getting it. They're not even just about managing, and they've got little help today. We call for additional support for social care. But the funding being provided today is only a stopgap measure. Our social care system will not be secure without long-term funding. Tonight, many elderly people will remain trapped in their homes, isolated and lonely, lacking the care they need because of this continuing cuts to social care. You can't cut social care without also hitting the NHS. The supposed £10 billion funding allocated is a restatement of an earlier commitment, but the Health Select Committee described this £10 billion claim as, and I quote, misleading and incorrect. The real amount is less than half that claimed. The result? We now have 3.9 million people on NHS waiting lists, more than ever. Many of those 3.9 people are waiting in pain, and they got no relief today. No relief today. Across the country, hospitals are facing losing their accident emergency units, losing their maternity units, and losing their specialist units. This Tory government is failing patients, and also failing the dedicated NHS staff that serve us so well. This is the first time healthcare spending per head has declined since the NHS was created. And I fear there will be a crisis in funding and care over this Christmas. The NHS cares for us. We should care for the NHS. On education, members of this government have also overseen the biggest real terms cuts in education for 4 decades. £1 in every 7 has been cut from FE college budgets, and Conservative policy has saddled a generation of students with a lifetime of debt. How can a government seriously talk about supporting a 21st century economy when they're planning to pour tens of millions into the failed 20th century policy of grammar schools, segregating our children at an early age? On housing, the Chancellor has announced today that he's scrapping pay-to-stay proposals and letting agents' fees. This U-turn is a victory for Labour's campaigning against both the tenant tax and letting fees. The Chancellor has spoken before of the dream of home ownership for the young. Nothing announced today is of the scale needed to suggest it will remain anything other than a dream. The hard facts are these. The government of which he was a member built fewer homes than at any point since the 1920s. There are now 250,000 fewer homeowners under 35. The Chancellor today could have delivered the scale of investment required to build the homes we need and create a new generation of home ownership. He significantly failed. I'm grateful that as a result of the campaign from the Honourable Member for Wentworth and Dean that the Wentworth and Woodhouse building will be saved. I'm grateful. The accusation was that a Labour government opened an open cast mine near to it and threatened it. That was the Labour government, I believe, in 1947. I just wish some of the policies pursued by Tory governments since the 1950s could be reversed so easily. The biggest failure of investment is this. The Chancellor has failed to address properly this government's most consistent shortcoming. His predecessor cut public investment to the lowest it's been since the 1990s. Instead of delivering the ambitious investment this economy needs across the whole country, the Chancellor has failed to recognise the scale of the challenge today. He also risked repeating the mistakes from last year with the National Flood Resilience Plan, failing to provide the protection our communities need. Just 1 in 5 of the projects in the investment pipeline are under construction, and there are 82 billion of shovel-ready projects still delayed. The infrastructure gap between London and the rest remains unbridged. London was scheduled to receive 12 times the public investment per head of the north east of England. But the 1.1 billion of investment in transport is a re-announcement. The Oxford to Cambridge rail link is significantly delayed against Network Rail's original planned completion date of March 2019. There are just no new ideas here, just a promise to deliver what they've previously failed to deliver on. This is press release policy making and not provision. And all we need now is the return of the high-vis jacket. The fourth industrial revolution will not be delivered. The fourth industrial revolution will not be delivered on delays, on old news and re-announcements. At last, the government has realised its mistake and now talk about an industrial strategy, words that ministers refused to even refer to in the past. But it isn't enough just to change a few ministerial titles. The government and the Chancellor need to deliver. But we've yet to see the proposed Green Paper on industrial strategy that was promised over the summer. The same government that now talks also up high-tech investment oversaw a £1 billion cut in real terms to science funding in the last Parliament. The OECD recommends that developed countries should be spending 3% of GDP on science. And what we've heard today, the new spending will lift our expenditure from 1.7% of GDP to a mere 1.8%. And it's the same familiar story for business. The Chancellor is continuing the race to the bottom on corporation tax, while continuing to cut the cuts to public services. The Chancellor is cutting taxes to big business. We know it's not the headline tax rates that encourage long-term investment from businesses. Business investment has been revised down every year under this government. What encourages business investment is knowing they have access to skilled workers, to world-class infrastructure and to major markets. Today's grim economic forecasts show the challenge ahead. The Chancellor admitted over the summer that it was time for a change of course. He has now had to abandon his government's fiscal charter with its failed hard surplus target. Labour warned that a hard surplus target lacks the flexibility to adapt to economic circumstances and the capacity to allow investment. The Chancellor's U-turn today demonstrates just how right we've been over this last year. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, only weeks ago, the Prime Minister offered a hope of change. The Chancellor offered to reset economic policy. Today we've seen the very people the Prime Minister promised to champion betrayed. The Chancellor has failed to break with the economic strategy of austerity. The country remains unprepared and ill-equipped to meet the challenges of Brexit and secure Britain's future as a world-leading economy. After all the sacrifices people have made over the last 6 years, I fear today's statement has laid the foundations for more wasted years. Only a Labour government will deliver on the ambition and vision to rebuild and transform our economy so that no one and no community is left behind.